3 a.m. Inside a vast mansion drowned in silence, an insomniac billionaire walked down to the kitchen. And he saw something he knew he would never forget for the rest of his life. A 17-year-old girl, thin, with reddened, burning hands, was quietly washing stacks of dirty dishes in the dark. The hot water had made her skin bleed. Every slight clatter of dishes sounded like a silent plea for help. She wasn't a housemaid, and she had no reason to be here at this hour. Yet the fear in her eyes told him one thing. This girl was carrying a secret powerful enough to destroy her entire future. And this was the moment that opened a story that would stretch across half a century. The debt that had never been repaid. A life that seemed to be fading, now waiting to be saved. The house was pitch dark, silent to the point where one could hear the ticking of each passing second. Arthur Coleman, a man who had grown used to commanding even the fiercest storms at sea, was now completely powerless against his own insomnia. He walked down the stairs, his silk robe carrying the chill of the night air. At that moment, a very faint sound echoed. Not an alarm, not unfamiliar footsteps, just the quiet placement of a glass on the granite countertop. A sound so soft that if it hadn't been 3 a.m., Arthur would never have noticed. But in that absolute silence, it rang out like a whisper. He stopped, listened, and turned toward the kitchen at the end of the hallway, which felt endless. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small yellow light above the stove spilled out, illuminating the back of a young girl. She was far too small for the vast kitchen around her, as if trying to hide herself among the cold stainless steel sinks. Arthur cleared his throat softly. She spun around instantly. The glass slipped from her fingers, almost falling to the floor. Her eyes, startled, then immediately shifting into a primal fear, as though she had been caught committing an unforgivable sin. I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman. Her voice trembled, as if every word she spoke carried weight. Arthur looked at her, unable to recognize who she was. He had employees, but he rarely paid attention to each one individually. "Who are you?" he asked, not harshly, but in a way that demanded an answer. "I'm Clare. Clare Miller. Helen's daughter. She's the cleaner, sir." The girl bowed her head as low as she could, as if wishing she could disappear right there. But Arthur Coleman, a man who had built an empire by reading every glance, every tiny flinch, could sense clearly that she wasn't here simply to help her mother. There was something bigger, heavier, more painful, holding her in place. Arthur stood still for a few seconds, observing the girl. Small hands, cracked from the hot water, hair tied up hastily, damp and clinging from sweat, and her face, pale, as if even blinking caused her pain. He didn't say anything more. He simply let his eyes wander around the kitchen, a whole battlefield left behind from the dinner party the night before, piles of dishes enough to keep 3 staff members busy for hours. Yet this girl was quietly taking it all on alone, in the dark. "You said your mother caught a cold?" Arthur asked, voice gentle but sharp. Claire nodded quickly, almost as if afraid he'd noticed the trembling lie hiding in the corner of her eyes. An answer too rushed, too forced, too... Something isn't right. Arthur didn't press further. He just stood there, arms folded, silent. A silence so heavy it made breathing difficult. Claire turned her back, trying to keep washing, trying to look busy, but the hand holding the plate shook with every movement. And then Arthur saw it. An old, worn-out backpack was lying in the corner, next to the side door leading to the backyard. It didn't resemble a typical teenager's backpack, too old, too heavy. Its zipper stretched tight as if it were carrying an entire life inside. Arthur walked toward it. Claire flinched, blurting out, "Please, don't. That's mine." But Arthur had already seen what was dangling from the zipper. a blue and gold tassel glimmering under the kitchen light. Something only a valedictorian, the top student of the senior class, was awarded. Something that belonged to a bright future. Arthur picked it up, turning it lightly in his hand. Yours? Clare swallowed hard. Yes. Valedictorian? He asked again, this time softer, not accusatory, but touched by an unexpected sadness. The girl bowed her head. Yes, but I'm not in school anymore. The words dropped onto the kitchen floor like a shard of glass, small but painful. Then Arthur looked at the side pocket of the backpack, a small picture frame, so old its edges were peeling. Inside was a man in uniform, smiling gently, eyes bright with resolve. Arthur froze. 101st Airborne Division, Baker Company. A strange feeling crept up his spine, as if an invisible hand was pulling him back into a past he had locked away long ago. He lifted his gaze, looking at Clare again. This time his eyes were no longer those of a billionaire, but of a man beginning to recognize that a crucial missing piece of his own life had just appeared in front of him. A sense of intuition stirred, a question not yet formed but shaking violently inside him. Who exactly was this girl in the story of his own life? Clare hurried over to grab the backpack as if trying to hide every trace of her life. Arthur didn't stop her, but in his eyes something had changed. It was no longer the simple curiosity of a wealthy employer. It was the instinct of a man who had lost too much and was beginning to sense that he might be standing before something familiar, yet painful. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the edge of his office window, Arthur was already seated at his desk. In front of him was a calendar packed with meetings in Hong Kong, London, and Dubai. But his mind was trapped back in last night's dark kitchen, in those bleeding hands and the terrified eyes of the girl. He picked up the phone, his voice low, steady. George, I need you. Just a few minutes later, his longtime assistant, George Shaw, stood at the door, straightening his tie neatly as always. A man far too familiar with the dense silence inside Arthur's office. What's happened, sir? Arthur didn't beat around the bush. Helen Miller. I need to know her condition, everything, and also her daughter, Clare. George blinked. This wasn't a standard request. His boss rarely showed interest in the personal lives of employees. Last night, that girl was in my kitchen at 3 a.m., Arthur said, washing all the dishes from the dinner party. Alone. George nodded lightly. Yes, sir. I'll look into it. One more thing, Arthur said slowly. There was a photo in her backpack. A serviceman from the 101st Airborne. Find out who he is. George looked at his employer. For the first time in many years, he saw something in Arthur's eyes unusual. Not anger, not annoyance, but unease. That afternoon, George returned with a thin file. His expression had turned serious, rarely seen. Sir, you may want to sit down. Arthur frowned. George only said that when there was bad news. Go ahead, Arthur said. George opened the file. Helen Miller is not suffering from a cold. She has severe lupus. Her immune system is attacking her own organs. She has been unable to work full-time for 2 months. Arthur's fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. A cold heaviness spread through his chest. George continued. The medication, the type required for her condition, was denied by insurance. Cost? $900 a month. $900. A number that to Arthur was no more than a cheap dinner bill. But to Helen, it was life itself. George paused for a moment before continuing. Helen was fired from her second job due to too many absences. The cleaning job at your residence is her only remaining income. Arthur looked down at the desk, silent, for a long time. George placed Claire's academic records in front of him. She used to be the top student of the entire grade, a perfect 4.0 GPA, awarded a full scholarship from Georgetown. He swallowed. But she has missed 25 consecutive days of school. The scholarship was... In the dimming afternoon light, Arthur drove an old sedan out of his wealthy neighborhood. No driver, no security escort, just himself, like a man searching for a piece of memory he had long lost. The city slowly changed around him. Clean, orderly streets gave way to cracked alleys. High-end boutiques gave way to old laundromats, shabby gas stations, and 1970s apartment blocks. Arthur stopped in front of a gray building, stained walls, an outdoor staircase that creaked with every step someone took. He drew a deep breath. A strange feeling washed over him, as if he were returning to a place from his past, even though he had never lived here. He knocked on the door of apartment 3B. It opened just a crack, held back by an old chain lock. A pair of tired eyes peered through the gap. Then he heard the jingle of the chain. The door opened fully. And standing before him was no longer the fast, tidy woman he had known for the past 5 years. It was a mother falling apart. Helen Miller. Pale skin, fingers so swollen she couldn't straighten them. Every step was supported by a metal walker, something that had never appeared in Arthur's home. Arthur stood there, stunned. "Helen," he whispered. The woman swallowed back tears. "Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry. I'll return to work. Just give me a few more days, just a few more." Her voice trembled and cracked as though every word sliced into her pride. Arthur stepped inside. The small room was dim, warmed only by a weak electric heater flickering in the corner. No TV sound, no central heating. Only poverty, trying desperately to hide behind thin walls. He meant to ask about Clare, but Helen spoke first. She looked down, hands trembling on the chair. You saw her, didn't you?" Arthur sat on the wooden chair across from her. "Yes, last night." Helen lifted a hand to her face and broke into tears, as if she had been holding them back for far too long. She promised me she wouldn't do that again. She's only 17. She doesn't deserve to live like this." Between sobs, Helen told her story. Each sentence cut through the silence like a blade. She couldn't afford her medication. She lost her second job because of her illness. Electricity, water, and gas were being cut off one by one. Clare hid the fact that she'd been expelled. And every night, she secretly worked the late shift at a diner, saving every cent. "You know," Helen whispered through broken breaths, "she threw the Georgetown scholarship letter into the trash. She said, there's no point accepting it if she's about to lose her mother." Arthur closed his eyes. A familiar, aching tightness struck his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he learned his brother would never return from the battlefield. A pain that, even after all these years, still felt like yesterday. He opened his eyes, looked at the trembling woman in front of him, and in that moment, a piece of memory inside him clicked into place. "The photo in her backpack," Arthur said quietly. "That soldier, who was he to you?" Helen looked up, surprised. "That was my father, Captain Robert Miller. He passed away long ago, but he served in Baker Company." Arthur swallowed, a cold shiver running down his spine. Baker Company. My brother, Arthur murmured, voice tightening. Thomas Coleman served in that same unit. Helen froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Arthur looked at her, eyes emotional yet firm. Your father was the one who wrote the last 3 letters to my mother. The letters that kept her alive, after my brother didn't come home. The room sank into silence. Not the silence of poverty or despair, but the silence that comes when 2 distant lives suddenly realize they were connected by a battlefield half a century ago. One man wrote letters that helped another family stand again, and today, one man returned to repay that debt. Arthur leaned back in his chair, releasing a long, slow breath. I owe your family a debt I thought I would never have the chance to repay. And that, it was the moment that changed the fate of 3 lives forever. The apartment door suddenly opened a second time. Rushed footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway. Mom? Mom, I'm home! Claire froze at the doorway. Her uniform was stained with grease, hair messy, a few strands sticking to her cheek. Her hands were trembling, still carrying the smell of the diner and the weight of exhaustion. Her eyes immediately locked onto Arthur. The panic buried deep inside them could have crushed anyone's heart. He knows, Helen whispered, as if confessing a sin she could no longer hide. Claire dropped her apron. The slight, brittle sound of it hitting the floor, in that moment it felt like the shattering of an entire world. She stepped back, then another step. I'm sorry, Mom. I broke some dishes at the diner. Mitch yelled. I got scared. I didn't know he was here. Her words fell apart, like the final breaths of someone who had held themselves together for far too long. Then Claire collapsed to her knees before her mother, all strength gone. She clung to Helen's frail legs and sobbed uncontrollably. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry you had to see me like that. I just wanted to make enough for the medicine. I just wanted you to hurt less. Helen's trembling hand moved down, resting on her daughter's head. Those swollen fingers shook so severely she could barely lift them, yet she still tried to comfort her child, as if Claire were still so little. No, you don't apologize, Claire. Helen's voice broke. No one should trade their youth for nights like these. Especially not you. Claire cried even harder, as if everything she'd buried over the past 2 months, the sleepless nights, the shouted insults, the cuts on her hands, the frantic rush from school to the diner, all of them finally found their release in those collapsing tears. Arthur stood in a corner, watching everything, and he saw another kind of war. A war not fought on battlefields, but in kitchens, in hospitals, in cold apartments. A war these 2 women had been fighting silently and completely alone. Arthur stepped forward, his voice deep but no longer sharp. That's enough. Claire looked up, terrified. Please, don't fire my mother. I'll work more shifts. I'll take longer hours. Claire, Arthur's tone cut through, firm and unshakable. You don't have to carry anything else. She shook her head repeatedly. No, you don't understand. If Mom loses her job, we'll get evicted. She needs her medication. I'm almost there, just a few more nights. Arthur knelt slightly, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder. A rare gesture, gentle, but resolute. You've done more than anyone your age should ever have to do. Now, let me take care of the rest. Claire held her breath, unable to believe what she had just heard. Helen looked at him, eyes red, voice quivering like a thin breeze. Mr. Coleman, You don't owe us anything. Please don't burden yourself because of me and my daughter. Arthur shook his head softly, not in refusal, but as if correcting a long-buried truth. Helen, I owe your family far more than you realize. The room fell still. The air froze, waiting for his following words. He looked at Clare, then at Helen. His voice dropped, so sincere and heavy that both of them stopped breathing. There are debts that never disappear. They only wait for the right day and the right people to be repaid. A single tear fell down Helen's cheek, and that was the moment just before the decision that would change the rest of their lives. My turn. The room fell quiet, not the silence of despair from before, but the silence of hope. I hoped that neither mother nor daughter had felt that way in months. Arthur rose, looking at both of them, his voice softening. From now on, you don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to choose between medicine and a future. Clare lifted a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back her sobs. Arthur spoke his final words, like a promise carried with his whole heart. Starting tonight, you are no longer fighting alone. And that was the moment an entirely new chapter began. A chapter no longer filled with darkness, but with light, slowly breaking through. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the old window frames, the worn-down apartment complex witnessed something rare. A sleek, black luxury car is parked right out front. Clare stepped out with George Shaw, the polished, composed assistant. Helen, meanwhile, was gently helped into a specialized medical transport vehicle by a nurse. Neighbors peeked through half-opened doors, confused but faintly relieved for them, because everyone around here knew the Miller women had lived in silence and suffering for far too long. At the Cleveland Clinic, Helen entered a bright, spotless examination room so clean it nearly overwhelmed her. Nurses greeted her by name. Dr. Aris, the doctor Arthur had described as the best, shook her hand with a warm, genuine smile. Ms. Miller, today we start fresh. I'm here to help you get your life back. Helen broke into tears the moment she heard those words, not because of pain, but because, for the first time in months, she felt like someone saw her as a human being. In the days that followed, she received proper medication, complete testing, a personalized diet plan, and psychological therapy. The swelling eased. The pain subsided. She slept. She breathed. And for the first time, she no longer feared tomorrow. Meanwhile, Clare returned to school. George walked beside her, holding a folder of documents. When they stepped into the principal's office, the principal, a woman who had long worried about Clare, sprang to her feet. Clare, where have you been for an entire month? I was worried sick. Clare lowered her head. Because my mom. George stepped forward. These are the medical records regarding Clare's mother. Clare has been her primary caregiver all this time. The principal skimmed through the papers. The frustration in her expression melted into understanding. Then she pulled Clare into a hug. Oh, sweetheart, you didn't have to carry all of that alone. Clare cried. But these tears were different, lighter, warmer. We'll arrange your makeup exams, the principal said, and the Georgetown scholarship. We'll work with them. Clare, you will graduate. I promise. Clare nodded. For the first time, those promises didn't feel like pressure. They felt like support. The apartment brought back to life. That afternoon, when Clare returned home, she saw something that widened her eyes. The lights were on. The heater was running. The kitchen was stocked with real food. The faucets flowed strongly. No more cold, no more darkness, no more hunger gnawing at her stomach. She touched the light switch, afraid it might go out, then pressed a hand against the heater. She felt the warmth spread across her palm, and tears returned. But this time, not from despair, from relief. Clare begins rebuilding herself. She opened her books again. Pages that once felt painful, reminding her of a future lost, now felt like doors reopening. She studied through the night. Not out of fear, but out of hope. For 2 weeks, the lives of the Miller women were slowly stitched back together, like a torn painting being restored piece by piece. Helen grew stronger every day. Clare excelled again, scoring high on her exams. Her Georgetown scholarship was reinstated. The apartment became a real home. And Arthur, though he seldom spoke, quietly monitored every step of their progress. Until on one sunny morning, Clare received an email from the school. "Congratulations, you have been officially reinstated as valedictorian." She covered her face and cried in the middle of the small apartment, not because she was hurting, but because she was finally back on her path. Thanks to whom? Thanks to her mother. Thanks to herself. And thanks to a man who woke up at 3 a.m. at the exact moment destiny called. Helen cried in Arthur's embrace. Arthur watched the girl on the stage, silent, yet his eyes were glowing with a pride he hadn't felt in years. That speech. It was not only for a graduation ceremony. It was for an entire life that had been lifted at the exact right moment, but from the feeling that finally he had closed a circle in his life. And that afternoon, as the sunlight slipped away from the field, Arthur Coleman stood beside the mother and daughter, not as a billionaire, not as an employer, but as part of their family. For the first time in many sleepless years, he felt a quiet peace settle inside his chest, a warm silence strong enough to soothe all the empty nights he had endured. He knew. Today, he had done something right, profoundly right. Summer passed quietly and warmly, as if life itself were trying to make up for every cold, unforgiving month the Miller women had endured. Helen slowly recovered. The swelling eased. The steady treatments restored a vitality she thought she had lost forever. One August morning, Arthur called Helen to his home library, a room that very few employees had ever stepped inside. She entered, slightly nervous. Large boxes of documents were neatly stacked on the heavy wooden table. Arthur stood by the window, sunlight brushing over his silver hair, giving him a solemn yet gentle presence. "You wanted to see me?" Helen asked softly. Arthur turned, his voice low but warm. "Helen, I have a job for you." She immediately shook her head. "No, Mr. Coleman. I can't accept anything more. You've already done too much for me and my daughter." Arthur smiled, a rare, soft smile Helen had never seen before. "This isn't a gift. It's a responsibility, and I believe only you can do it well." He pointed at the boxes. "My mother had a small foundation. She called it the Baker Company Fund, created to help the children and grandchildren of veterans in need." Helen froze. "I rebuilt the fund," Arthur continued, "but it needs a leader, someone who understands sacrifice and what it means to be too afraid to ask for help." His eyes held hers as if he could see every wound she had carried. "No one is more suited than you, Helen." Helen covered her mouth and burst into tears, not from sadness, but because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't just being helped, she was being trusted. And as for Clare, The day she left for Georgetown, the sky was impossibly blue. A bright yellow taxi waited in front of the building, her small suitcase already on the back seat. Arthur handed her a thin box. Clare opened it. A brand new silver laptop, light as air. "For your first essays," Arthur said, smiling softly. Clare hugged the box to her chest. "I'll use it well, I promise." Arthur handed her another envelope. Inside was the original battlefield photograph, so old the edges had softened with time. "But you said this one belonged to Tommy," Clare whispered. "Precisely," Arthur replied. "It should be with the person who continued the part of life he never got to live." Clare's voice caught. She held the photo tightly, as if holding the legacy of both families. She looked at Arthur, the man who, just months earlier, had been nothing more than a distant name. Now, he had become a pillar she couldn't put into words. And Clare said something Arthur would remember for the rest of his life. "You saved my mother and me. But more importantly, you made me believe this world still has good people." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he replied with the sentence that left her speechless. "No, Clare. The world is better because of people like you. I simply helped you see who you already were." Those two sentences, like two delicate brushstrokes, unexpectedly revealed a truth. Kindness doesn't just save others. It reflects the light already inside them. Clare hugged her mother, then hugged Arthur, and finally stepped into the taxi. The car rolled forward, turning at the small corner of the street. Helen and Arthur stood together, watching until it disappeared. A breeze tugged gently at Arthur's vest. He lifted his face toward the blue sky, a sky belonging to a morning no longer heavy. And for the first time in many years, he felt he could sleep in peace. Thank you for staying with me until the end of today's story. If this story touched you, even for a moment, please leave a comment. I'd genuinely love to hear how it made you feel. And if you believe kindness can spread, if just one person stops to lift another, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales so we can continue sharing stories. See you in the following video.